Hello and good afternoon. This is Stephen Tromans. Thank you for joining us for this further event in our series of webinars looking at the UK and EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We have done a couple of these previously looking at some of the general provisions, and we thought it would be a good idea to actually do a series of specific ones dealing with certain subject matter topics. So this time we're dealing with aviation, chemicals, waste and waste to energy. And we will do a future event, if you'd like to pencil it in your diaries, on the 15th of April, it's planned for, where we look at some other specific areas from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I'll introduce my fellow presenters in a moment, but just a couple of practical things. First of all, we will try and answer questions that you raise at the end of our presentations. If you'd like to use the Q&A function, I'm sure you're very familiar with that on Zoom, and put in your questions. We will do our best to give you a response to them. And secondly, do be aware of all of the resources which are available on our 39 Essex website on this and many other matters, not only in planning and environment, but many other areas of law. They include past webinars, newsletters, podcasts, lots of other things, a guide to the Environment Bill, currently in abeyance, but due to come back, no doubt, into Parliament at some point. So please feel free to use those. The batting order is essentially Richard, who is going to deal with aviation. Richard has recently hopped back from the Stansted inquiry, so is well equipped to talk about aviation. Gethin Thomas, who's going to deal with chemicals and REACH, Ruth Keating on waste, and Tom van der Klugt on waste to energy. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Richard, and it will just simply follow through there in the order that I've described.
Thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon all. Yes, last Friday was the last day of a 7-week inquiry about the future of Stansted Airport. A lot of argument about the effect of COVID and climate change requirements on the future of aviation, much less about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and what that might do to UK aviation. So I suppose one question that we can think about today is whether that, in addition to those other two factors, poses problems or opportunities for the future of UK aviation. Many of you will have tuned in at the last episode where Gethin, Ruth and Stephen started this particular series, and will therefore know that on Christmas Eve, the European Union and the UK agreed a comprehensive trade agreement setting out the basis for the future trade relationship between those two. The TCA was approved by 27 EU countries and by the UK Parliament. It goes further than the contingency regulations that had been published in early December of the year before last. They were a contingency measure to guard against the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. In fact, as we all know, that didn't come to pass. So instead, we rely on the provisions relating to aviation in the TCA. And those provisions provide several important operational flexibilities and further rights which will benefit UK and EU passengers, cargo and charter operations. For those of you wanting to look at the detail of those, they're to be found under heading 2 of the agreement, and in particular 2 titles within heading 2, Air Transport and Aviation Safety, which are titles 1 and 2 respectively. And they are, you've got the page references there in a pretty hefty document. Next slide, please. So the areas that I'll be looking at today fairly swiftly, I've got about 8 minutes, they're not all the areas that are covered, but they're the key areas as I saw it when I looked through and considered the document. Air traffic rights, code sharing and blocked space agreements, leasing of aircraft and their teams, their crew, ownership and control of aircraft, recognition of existing authorisations, and then future authorisations and aviation safety. And then finally, before drawing some of the threads together, non-discrimination. So the first one, air traffic rights, the 4 freedoms, well, there are 9 freedoms actually identified by the International Civil Aviation Organization, but 4 of them, the first 4, provide an ability to fly between EU and UK destinations and originating locations. That continues through the agreement, unlimited rights to fly between those 2. There aren't 5th freedoms, and these relate to cargo only, where there is travel between EU and UK destinations or locations, and then on to a 3rd country. So that would need yet to be negotiated. And there are no provision for scheduled intra-EU-UK flights for the UK in the EU. So that means there isn't provision for UK operators or carriers to run flights within a country, say flying between Barcelona or Murcia, as Ryanair, for example, does. There isn't provision for that sort of flight arrangement at the moment in the agreement. Next slide, please. So code sharing, this is where a particular flight code is shared between carriers, usually from the, if it's an international flight, from the 2 countries in question. The agreement permits code sharing between the UK and the Union and 3rd country carriers, provided that relevant operating carrier has the necessary rights to perform that service. A UK marketing carrier can enter into a code sharing arrangement to offer a service from the UK to an EU destination and then onwards to a final destination either in the European Union or onwards to a 3rd country. However, a new requirement is that customers must be informed which carrier is operating which sector of the relevant service. And this is something that in the past we've more or less taken for granted. Now, passengers must be told who is operating which leg of the journey. And then finally, any code sharing arrangement may be subject to the approval of the relevant aviation authorities of the carriers involved, who will ensure that safety, security, and competition requirements are met. So there, as we'll see in other contexts, some degree of increased red tape. I think one could put it in that way. Next slide, please. So far as leasing of aircraft goes, there are 2 types. There's dry leasing, as it's known in the industry, aircraft only, and what's known as wet leasing, aircraft plus crew, from EU carriers. EU carriers can only wet lease, however, from the UK carriers if the leasing can be justified, whether on the basis of exceptional need or seasonal capacity or operational difficulties of the lessee. And then even when those tests are satisfied, the duration of such a lease must be as limited as is strictly necessary to fulfill that need or to overcome a relevant difficulties. So in other words, the EU will apply 3rd country restrictions to wet leasing, leasing with aircraft crew by EU carriers from UK carriers, but, and there's an asymmetry here, the UK will not introduce equivalent restrictions for UK air carriers wishing to wet lease from EU carriers. And I think that asymmetry, we'll see it repeated in 1 or 2 other areas that I'll be covering today, reflects really that there are more opportunities for EU carriers to find their crews, to lease their aircraft from within the European Union than now there are available to the UK so far as the European Union is concerned. The TCA acknowledges that leasing may also be subject to requirements imposed by the UK and EU member states providing for leasing arrangements to be approved by their relevant aviation authorities, to verify compliance with the conditions of the agreement, and safety and security requirements also. Both the EU and the UK agree that where this is the case, they will endeavour to expedite the approval process and reduce administrative burden on air carriers. And that last sentence, I think, reflects a considerable anxiety that existed within the industry at the time that these terms were being agreed about delays, about red tape. And bear in mind that all of that anxiety predated the pandemic and predated the sixth carbon budget, which was published in December very recently of last year, and draws aviation emission reduction within the umbrella of emission reductions more generally. They had previously always enjoyed an exemption, but if the government, which is due to respond to the sixth carbon budget, takes up the recommendations of the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, then the aviation industry, that sector, will find itself as challenged by the net zero commitments that the UK has entered into as other industries, whereas that hadn't been the case previously. So to the anxiety that was experienced then, we add more recent anxieties that are felt within the sector. Next slide, please. On ownership and control, the restrictions that existed previously are maintained. An air carrier of the UK is defined to be one that is majority owned and controlled by UK nationals, headquartered, licensed, and CAA certified in the UK. And that's important. This is a point at which the regulation of the sector is influenced by the passport that those that operate it happen to hold. And by, on the other hand, to be an air carrier of the EU, it must be both majority owned again and controlled by EU and or EEA or Swiss nationals, headquartered, licensed, and EASA certified in the EU. So almost symmetry there. Rather than the UK, it's EU or the economic area, European Economic Area, or Swiss nationals, but otherwise there are symmetrical arrangements. There are grandfathering provisions for UK carriers who had a valid EU license at the end of 2020, provided that they are owned and controlled by EU nationals, whether that be alone or in combination with UK nationals. It has to be majority owned by EU nationals. There is no equivalent grandfathering provision for EU air carriers controlled by UK nationals, again, whether in combination with EU nationals or not. And there again, an asymmetry reflective most likely of the fact that there are greater opportunities within the EU than outside of it, as the UK now experiences. Finally, a commitment to discuss the liberalisation of future ownership and control restrictions as part of the Specialised Committee on Air Transport, which is a committee formed to monitor the application of the agreement, initially within 12 months of the TCA coming into force. And that last provision reflects what we find in a number of the areas that I'm looking at today, a commitment to discuss further and enter into future agreements governing certain aspects of the regulation of the sector. To cut a long story short, the agreement, whilst it goes further than the contingency arrangements that were put in place, not last December, but the previous one, leaves nonetheless a number of areas uncovered or unaddressed so far as their regulation is concerned. Next slide, please. So on to recognition of existing authorisations. Certificates of airworthiness, licences and certificates of competency issued by the European Union or the UK, which are valid and still in force, will rather sensibly, I'd suggest, continue to be recognised by the other party for the purposes of conducting air services, provided also that the Chicago Convention requirements are met. And in order for that licence to have been issued in the first place, there's an overwhelming likelihood that those Chicago Convention requirements were met. There are, again, additional procedures for consultation on safety issues and for ramp inspections, both of those being really essential, ongoing cooperative needs. Next slide, please. Aviation safety, which draws in future licensing and permitting arrangements. The TCA provides for cooperation on aviation safety, for example, in the areas of airworthiness, operation, air traffic management, and personnel training and licensing. There are to be annexes to be developed by the Specialised Committee on Air Transport, which will outline the scope of the cooperation in each relevant area. Again, not yet in place, but something that is in prospect and in respect of which provision is made in the TCA. These will also set out the terms of UK-EU mutual recognition of future findings of compliance and certification. There is an existing annex that is relevant to the aviation sector that deals with airworthiness and environmental certification. And then finally, provision also made for future information exchange in relation to safety and proposals to revise laws in this area. But the UK is no longer a member of the European Aviation Safety Agency, which is one of the more recent agencies of the European Union, headquartered in Cologne in Germany. And suffice it to say that the measures that we find in the TCA are not as exhaustive, are not as comprehensive as those which the European Aviation Safety Agency concerns itself with. Next slide, please. And so, almost finally, onto non-discrimination. Anyone who tuned in to the last session on the TCA will have heard from all of our then three speakers about the general level playing field requirements of the TCA. Air transport services are subject to that general level playing field provisions, which relate more generally to social and environmental issues, but also to some rather more specific provisions in relation to non-discrimination in the provision of ground handling services, allocation of slots, and aircraft fuel taxation. The agreement provides for both parties to ensure effective and non-discriminatory measures for consumer protection, including compensation for denied boarding, cancellation, and delays, and to consult with each other as to their proposed measures for this. Now, EU Regulation 261/2004 dealt specifically with all of those travel mishaps and with arrangements for compensation to passengers that were made available. Thanks to Section 3 of the European Union Withdrawal Act of 2018, the provisions of those regulations were transposed into UK law on the 1st of January of 2021, and a fortnight later, the snappily entitled the Air Passenger Rights and Air Traveller Organisations Licensing Amendment EU Exit Regulations of 2019 amended the Civil Aviation Denied Boarding Compensation and Assistance Regs, which bring all of those areas into line with EU legislation. Next slide, please. And so to finish up, the agreement brought an undoubted aviation industry sigh of relief that a relatively comprehensive UK-EU aviation agreement was reached, certainly more comprehensive than the contingency regulations that had been put in place on an emergency basis. It preserves the basic connectivity for UK-EU air transport services and shows a degree of pragmatism in many areas, such as the recognition of existing certification and grandfathering for UK air carriers with substantial EU shareholdings. And after all, why not? If those arrangements are in place, there is all the sense in the world for allowing them to continue, subject to the ownership requirements that are made. However, the TCA is not the last word in EU-UK aviation matters, and I've referred on 2 or 3 occasions in the course of the last few minutes of areas where there is a hope that further agreement and further cooperative regulation could yet be put in place. It does establish a framework for that future dialogue in certain key areas, such as safety, aviation safety, and the liberalisation of ownership and control restrictions. And so back to the question with which I started. Whilst it didn't play a prominent role in the Stansted inquiry just finished, there is a question to be asked about whether the TCA, so far as aviation is concerned, prevents impediments or obstacles to future regulation to add to the problems that the sector is currently experiencing through what I've described as crosswinds of a pandemic and the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions now visited upon the aviation industry as upon other industries? I would suggest that the answer to that question is that whilst it was a lot better than the contingency arrangements put in place, compared to what went before, it presents a further obstacle, a further challenge to a sector already facing enormous difficulties. And with that, I will hand over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon. I'm going to be providing an overview of the TCA's implications for the regulation of chemicals in the UK. By way of background, EU REACH, the Registration, Evaluation, Authorisation and Restriction of Chemicals Regulation, is the main legislation for the regulation of chemicals in the EU. It is a single market measure which applies beyond the EU member states to the wider European Economic Area, which includes Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. The REACH regulation entered into force on the 1st of June 2007. REACH requires substances that are manufactured or imported into the EEA to be registered with the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, which was established pursuant to the 2006 regulations. It then provides a regulatory framework to control or restrict the use of hazardous substances based on those registrations. And the registrations include safety information about the chemical and its uses. Without providing the necessary safety data, companies cannot place their products onto the market. And this is known as the no data, no market principle. REACH also provides a framework for banning or restricting the use of hazardous chemicals if risks cannot be managed. In short, REACH exists for the purposes of improving the protection of human health and the environment from hazardous chemicals, as well as facilitating trade in chemicals across the single market. The chemical industry is a key manufacturing sector in the UK, accounting for some 9% of total UK goods exports pre-Brexit. Trade in chemicals is highly intertwined with the EU. 57% of chemical exports in 2019 went to EU member states, and 73% of chemical imports came from the EU. Moreover, manufacturing industries often have complex supply chains with chemicals crisscrossing UK-EU borders many times. Following the UK's withdrawal from the EU on the 31st of January 2021, REACH continued to have effect in the UK, 2020 rather, until the end of the transition period in accordance with the withdrawal agreement. That meant that UK companies could continue to register chemicals with the ECHA, and registrations and authorisations remained valid in both the UK and EU markets during that time. But EU REACH ceased to have effect in Great Britain from the 1st of January 2021. REACH and other chemicals regulations were retained in domestic legislation at the end of the transition period by the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. And as I'll come on to explain, secondary legislation has also since been passed that amends REACH to make it work in a UK-only context. So what does the UK-EU Trading Cooperation Agreement cover? The TCA includes an annex, TBT3, which specifically addresses chemicals. Of course, the level playing field commitments prescribed Article 7 in the main body of the TCA, in particular the commitment not to regress on levels of environmental protection, are also, of course, relevant. Article 3.1 of the annex sets out the annex's objectives, which are on the slide, and notably, Article 3.2 also provides the parties acknowledge that the commitments made under the annex do not prevent either party from setting its own priorities on chemical regulation, including establishing its own levels of protection in respect of the environment and human and animal health. Practically, the TCA doesn't facilitate much closer cooperation than other third countries already enjoy with the ECHA. And there are three general overarching points on the degree of cooperation the TCA provides for to note. First, next slide please. Articles 7.2 and 7.4 of the annex commits both parties to facilitating the exchange only of non-confidential information, in particular in relation to chemical safety, whereas when the UK was part of EU REACH, it was also able to access confidential and commercially sensitive information. Secondly, the annex also includes the provision that the UK and the EU can enter into consultations on chemical safety, but such consultations are not made mandatory. Next slide, please. And thirdly, the annex promotes cooperation around international standards, specifically the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. However, these international standards do not provide the same level of protection as REACH itself. Perhaps most glaringly, there is no provision in the TCA for the UK to access the ECHA's REACH database containing all registration information including confidential or commercially sensitive data. And the chief executive of the Chemical Industries Association, trade union body, has complained that the failure to secure access under EU REACH would leave the industry facing a bill of more than £1 billion in unnecessarily duplicating that work for a new UK regime. The UK's REACH system does enable information submitted under EU REACH to be uploaded directly into the UK REACH IT system in respect of prospective applications. Next slide, please. The UK REACH regime was initially designed to establish a UK-wide market for chemicals applying to all chemical substances manufactured and imported in the UK, with the Health and Safety Executive established as the UK REACH competent agency, taking over the functions of the ECHA. These include, for example, enforcing compliance with registration requirements, evaluating applications for registration, and deciding on exemptions. Under the Northern Ireland Protocol, however, the EU REACH regulation will continue to apply to Northern Ireland after the end of the transition period. Northern Ireland businesses therefore retained their EU REACH status and obligations. So strictly speaking, UK REACH is actually GB REACH. Next slide, please. Secondary legislation was passed in March 2019 that amended the retained EU REACH regulation in the UK to make it work in a UK or GB only context. And I've set out the series of secondary legislation on the slide. And it's understood that DEFRA are currently working with the GLD to consolidate the REACH regulations in the near future. The government has stated that in terms of policy, the proposed UK REACH regime replicates the EU system as closely as possible, maintaining the fundamental aims and purposes of REACH. The practical implications of having separate systems, however, are significant. From the 1st of January this year, UK companies wishing to export chemicals to the EEA single market need to comply with EU REACH and any other relevant regulations. An application for an authorisation submitted by, held by a UK entity is no longer valid in the EU. Many companies will now require authorisations under both the EU and the UK regimes. Under the new UK system, it is possible for UK-based manufacturers to transfer an existing EU REACH registration into UK REACH, also known as grandfathering, to continue to have access to the GB market. Grandfathering provisions for manufacturers are contained in Articles 127A and 127B of Schedule 2 to the REACH EU Exit Regulations 2019. Please can I have the next slide. And there are a number of particular new features of the UK REACH regime which are worth drawing attention to. The first is that the UK REACH regime places a duty on the HSE to commission external scientific advice when developing its opinions on regulatory measures, except in circumstances where there are justifiable reasons not to. And the HSE has a much broader remit than the specialised ECHA, and this is a sensible requirement, although it might be difficult to envisage the circumstances in which it is not justified, or whether it is justified rather, not to seek external scientific advice. And the second is that the UK REACH regime also has a different mechanism for appeals against HSE regulatory decisions compared to the EU regime. Appeals against HSE decisions are now to be heard by the first-tier tribunal, which already hears appeals against government regulatory bodies on environment enforcement matters, such as appeals against Environment Agency fines. The main offence under the new regime is that of contravening any provision of the REACH Regulation 2006 that is listed in Schedule 1 to the REACH enforcement regulations, or causing or permitting another person to contravene one of those provisions. Obligations in Schedule 1 include a prohibition against manufacturing or placing on the market an unregistered substance, and more specifically, a requirement on an employer to provide workers with access to information about the substances that they may be exposed to at work. A failure to provide information to the HSE as required under the REACH Regulation 2006 as retained in UK law are now also offences too. Finally, how could the regime, or how might the regime change in future? Currently, the substantive level of regulation is intentionally broadly equivalent to the EU's, but that equivalence is not set in stone by the TCA. There is potential for divergence in the regulation of chemicals, such as, for example, the content of authorisation lists of substances of very high concern. Clause 131 and Schedule 20 of the Draft Environment Bill confer powers to amend the REACH regime. However, the Secretary of State may not make regulations which amend any of the protected provisions of the REACH regulation. And those protected, untouchable provisions are defined within Schedule 20 and include the fundamental principles which are set out on the right side of the slide, including Article 1, the aim and purpose of REACH, and Article 5, the no data, no market principle. Before making any amendments to the REACH regulations, the Secretary of State must publish an explanation of why she or he considers that the provision to be made by the regulations is consistent with Article 1 of the REACH regulations, i.e., how is it consistent with the aim and scope of the REACH regime. These provisions have prompted concerns from environment groups and some MPs about the potential for divergence between the UK and EU regimes. And Greener UK have called for additional articles to be added to that protected untouchable list in Schedule 20 to avoid a risk of the level of protection from hazardous chemicals being reduced. More generally, both industry and environmental stakeholders have raised concerns that the UK REACH regime will be costly for industry and lacks transparency, and there's been wide-ranging disappointment that the UK has not retained access to EU REACH. And I'm now going to hand over to Ruth to speak on waste.
Hi, Gethin, thank you for that. Hi, everyone. I'll be covering waste with a particular focus on two aspects. So the first is going to be on the implications of Brexit and the TCA for waste management and trade. And the second topic I'm going to briefly cover is the impact on importing and exporting waste. So in front of your screens there, what you'll see is Chapter 1. And in terms of a general background here, we covered Title 6 and the level playing field commitments in some detail in our previous webinar. And what's of course included there in the agreement are preventions for either the UK or the EU seeking a competitive edge in various regulatory areas. And as we'll go on to, waste would be one of those areas which could become relevant depending on divergence. Looking at your screen there, in terms of the breakdown of the most relevant provisions for the environment and for our purposes, they're first found in the general provisions under Chapter 1 and also under Chapter 7, which of course relates to the environment and climate. And it's worth briefly considering how these provisions intersect with waste. And so looking at the language of what we have there, in particular Article 1.1.4, which you'll see emphasised, it affirms that this is an economic relationship and that the commitments related to level playing fields are for open and fair competition. And the whole focus of those provisions is to prevent the distortion of trade or investment. And so if we look at our next slide there, which covers Article 7.1, we'll see Chapter 7, it's really for our purposes the most substantial part of the level playing fields. And what it provides for is the basis for this continued cooperation and also for the basis for detecting and preventing any distortions in trade and market manipulations. And it's of note there that specifically, we have a kind of non-inclusive definition there at Article 7.1.1, but what is referred to there quite near the top of that list is waste management. And I think we can already clearly see some of the implications or some of the advantages that could ultimately be sought were either party to this agreement to undermine the current protections that are provided in the field of waste management. If we look at the next slide there, and this brings us to the completion of the relevance of these provisions for waste, looking at Article 7.2, we see one of the most pivotal articles in terms of the level playing field provisions. And it's worth emphasising the wording again of that provision, because what it says is that a party shall not weaken or reduce in a manner affecting trade or investment between the parties its environmental levels of protection. And again, that of course refers back to the definition we have, which includes waste management. Now, one of the criticisms that's been launched against Article 7.2 is that it is relatively narrow in its ambit. And so I think we can clearly see that there are certain areas of environmental protection where this might be more or less difficult to prove. But looking at the topic which we're covering, waste, I think it's certainly an area where you can see Article 7.2 becoming extremely relevant. And that's particularly with things like producer responsibility and designing against waste. And so certainly moving forward, this is something which all parties are going to have to be mindful of, the intersection of waste and the level playing field provisions. And so in terms of the obligations which are already placed on importers and exporters of goods across the UK-EU border, this will require, of course, a number of things. But one of those will be the completion of security and safety declarations, import and export declarations, or obtaining a special permit to import or export certain goods. And that latter category, of course, obviously relates to waste and certain hazardous chemicals. And so I think moving forward, this is really an area to look at in terms of divergences which develop between the two parties, and certainly divergences which might develop over time as we move further and further away from the imminent date of Brexit. So if we look at the next slide there, we'll see obligations which already are placed on importers and exports. And the title there, of course, is Waste Import and Export. So what we need to think about then is, if we've looked at Article 7.2 and we're thinking about individual exporters and importers within the UK, how are these importers and exporters going to comply with the rules as they currently stand? Now, casting our minds back to January 2018, the European Commission issued a notice to stakeholders. And what that notice reminded those stakeholders of was that if the UK left the EU without a deal, import and export licenses issued by the UK would no longer be valid for shipments of waste to the remaining EU countries. And further, licenses issued by the EU would no longer be valid, of course, for shipments to the UK. Now, that position at the time is very stark, understandably caused much concern for stakeholders for which this was relevant. And thankfully, what we have received now is clarity, and some of that confusion has been avoided. Looking at your screen there, we see the list of the obligations which do apply now. So looking at what applies, the UK is a party to the Bâle Convention and a member of the OECD. Under the Bâle Convention on the control of transboundary movements of hazardous waste and their disposal, that governs international shipments of waste, and they're controlled through a series of prior written consent. And what this effectively allows for is for countries exporting hazardous waste to verify that the authorities in the destination countries are content to accept that proposed shipment, and that the waste can be managed in an environmentally sound manner at its final destination. And further, what the OECD does then is it provides the control framework for the transboundary movement of waste between OECD countries for energy recovery and recycling. And so the relevance of all of this is that from the 1st of January 2021, in relation to imports and exports of waste, the UK will be treated in the same way as any other OECD country or any country party to the Bâle Convention that intends to export waste to an EU country. And further, the current waste shipments procedures will still apply. Now, in practice, what this means is that we therefore have on your screens the three predominant categories generally of waste recognised by the EU. The first, of course, is the green list waste, and this is to which Article 18 or green list controls apply. Generally, what that means is it's a lower form of control than notification and mainly applies to shipping non-hazardous waste. If we look at the second point there, we see the amber list, and what this means, it's waste to which prior notification and consent is required. And finally, it's also worth flagging their prohibited waste, and nothing of importance has changed there. And what that includes is hazardous and household waste, and this waste is generally banned from export, but it is something permitted pursuant to special consideration. Now, what I would flag is, as a reminder, is that it's generally only permissible to export waste for recovery and not for disposal. And so why that's worth flagging is that in terms of exporters and importers considering their specific obligations going forward, thorough consideration should be given to the legal definition of recovery and disposal, and perhaps with reference to the Waste Framework Directive and associated case law, because we do already have a body built up there which is both detailed and very technical and helpful for those moving forward. Finally, if we look at the next slide and we get more of a sense there of the detail of the obligations that will be imposed. First, looking at the green list, what's included there is that a green list waste can be imported and exported to the EU without permission from countries involved in the shipment. But there's a number of important requirements which those exporters will have to keep in mind. That's first, of course, that they need to be able and licensed to handle that waste in an environmentally sound way, and that the recovery facility operates to human health and environmental protection standards. They'll also have to keep in mind their obligations to fully complete and sign an Annex 7 document, and that document, of course, must travel with the waste at all times. And finally, there needs to be a written contract drawn up, and that contract must ensure that if the shipment cannot be completed as planned for whatever reason, or is found to be illegal, the exporter will take that waste back and recover it in another way and provide for its storage. The second point there is the waste found on the amber list, and that can be exported and imported to and from the EU. However, what operators must do then is notify the relevant authority of the country from which waste will be exported and obtain consent from the competent authorities, and of course paying the associated fees. When it comes to the amber list, of course, understandably, it's a more curtailed list, and there's a number of people who would have to be a relevant party for the purposes of exporting waste. And that includes the original waste producer, the licensed new producer, a licensed collector of waste, a registered dealer or broker, with written authorization, or finally the holder of the waste when all of the above are unknown or insolvent. And so that's another important requirement the parties are going to have to remember and keep in mind in terms of their obligations. And so what we see there when we compare these categories is what these categories are really concerned with is reflecting the waste that is moved around has, by its very nature, a huge interconnectedness. And we also need to think about how any waste might be improperly disposed moving forward, and certainly how that might give a competitive advantage or otherwise to certain parties. And finally, what it's worth flagging there, because it's of huge relevance, of course, is increased plastic. And we see there the shipping of waste plastics. As a general rule, the waste plastics will either fall into the amber list or be prohibited, and so would be subject to notification control or special consideration. However, it's also worth flagging that the plastic could meet the BAL code B43011. And what that'll mean is it could fall into the green list so far as a number of requirements are met, and that's that it must be a single polymer plastic, almost free from contamination and other types of waste, and capable of recycling in an environmentally sound manner. Taking those two topics together and looking how the TCA and Brexit has impacted waste, what this all means for exporters in particular of waste is that they'll need to be very mindful of making sure that they're complying with their legal obligations. And further going forward to the original discussion we had on Title 6 of the TCA, waste management, I would imagine, is going to be one of those areas where there could be divergence moving forward, and certainly one where one could evidence that one party is seeking to affect trade or investment between the parties. And with that, I'm going to move on to Tom, who's going to cover waste to energy. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We really do appreciate it. I'm going to wrap up today's webinar with a very quick look at waste to energy and just seek to draw out a couple of themes in the way that interacts with the provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The picture you can see there is a waste to energy plant in South Bermondsey in London, which I used to go past every day on the train. That is the kind of thing that we will be talking about over the next few slides. So firstly, what is waste to energy? It seems like an obvious question, but it, as with most things, is slightly more complex than it seems at first sight. There are a number of interchangeable terms that are used to refer to this process, waste to energy, energy from waste being the two main ones. And you'll see the abbreviations WTE and EFW referring to this process as well. In 2014, the UK government produced a guide, Energy from Waste, a guide to the debate. And I've put a couple of quotes from this guidance there. And it uses this definition. Energy from waste is the process of creating energy, usually in the form of electricity or heat, but also potentially biofuels from the thermal treatment of a waste source via technologies such as incineration, anaerobic digestion, gasification, or pyrolysis. Now, the interesting point about that is that this can cover a very wide range of inputs into the waste to energy process of the type of waste you're putting in. It can also cover a wide range of processing of that waste and various different outputs, in particular electricity or heat. But what they share in common is that it is a thermal treatment of that waste that is being inputted. All of that being said, what most people think of as being waste to energy is incineration of municipal waste. And that's the kind of plant that I showed you in the picture on the first slide. And also, typically what we are looking at is incineration of residual waste. So that is waste that can't be recycled. And it is really, waste to energy is often seen as an alternative to landfill, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. This slide demonstrates just that process that I've been talking about in graphic form. And we can see there, and again, this is something I'll touch on later, it isn't a completely circular process. What it does is create energy out of waste, so it is energy recovery, but it's not a completely circular process. And of course, given that it is a thermal treatment of waste, it involves emissions. This slide shows the waste hierarchy, which many of you may well be familiar with. It is a hierarchy of ways to treat waste in terms of the least environmental damage. And it's set out, it is set out in law in the EU Waste Framework Directive and transmuted into national law by domestic provisions. And what you can see there is that waste to energy as a process occupies a relatively low place on this waste hierarchy. It straddles disposal and other recovery. So you can see there in the disposal category, it also lists landfill, incineration without energy recovery. And then in other recovery, you've got incineration with energy recovery, but it isn't full recycling. And as a result of that position in the waste hierarchy, there's been some debate over the last few years as to the role that waste to energy should play in terms of moving towards a more circular economy, achieving climate aims, reducing emissions, and so on. Again, I've quoted here from DEFRA's guide that they produced in 2014, and they came to the conclusion in that there had to be a place for waste to energy in terms of meeting all those aims that I've just mentioned. But there are also a number of cons in terms of waste energy, in particular the fact that it reduces emissions, and some say it does not provide an incentive to move towards a more producer responsible culture, and one where climate change aims, environmental aims are factored into the design of the product from the very beginning. So it's a somewhat controversial topic. And that really, I think, is the context in which we have to see the provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Of course, waste to energy has a foot in two camps. It's got a foot in the waste camp and a foot in the energy camp. Title 8 of Part 2 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement deals with energy, and Chapter 3 deals with safe and sustainable energy. I'm not going to be able to go through every single one of the provisions in detail, but I've picked out a couple here just to illustrate some of the sorts of issues that may arise from these provisions. Firstly, support for renewable energy. The agreement provides that biofuels, bioliquids and biomass shall only be supported as renewable energy if they meet robust criteria for sustainability and greenhouse gas emission saving, which are subject to verification. Now, I mentioned earlier that waste to energy can cover quite a wide variety of processes, and that does include some processes which would produce biofuels. The point that is being made here is that those processes have to be carried out in a way that meets the relevant emission standards, and that, as I mentioned, is a big issue in terms of how waste to energy contributes towards overall environmental targets. Article ENER 25 deals with cooperation on standards, and that states that the parties shall promote cooperation between regulators and standardization bodies with regards to energy efficiency and renewable energy. That's something I'm going to touch on in a minute, so just keep that provision in the back of your minds as we go forwards. I mentioned that waste to energy has a foot in each of those camps, waste and energy. And the second part of the agreement that's particularly relevant here, which Ruth has already touched on just a moment ago, are those provisions dealing with the level playing field for open and fair competition and sustainable development. And Ruth previously touched on Article 7.2, which is the non-regression provision, affirming the right of each party to set its policies and priorities in this area, but also obliging each party not to weaken or reduce in a manner affecting trade or investment its environmental levels of protection. Now, again, keep those provisions in your mind as we go into the next few slides, where I'll aim to draw some of the themes together and show how they might influence how those provisions play out in practice. Policy divergence has already been a strong theme of the talks today, and no less so for this topic. Waste policy in the UK is, of course, devolved, and we can't go through each jurisdiction today, but just to look briefly at the government's policy for England, Our Waste, Our Resources, published in 2018. As you can see from the quote there, the government quite clearly sees a strong place for energy from waste plants, and particularly those that operate in combined heat and power mode. There's an emphasis on improving efficiency of those plants. So while it's not front and central of the policy, it's still very much there. The key EU policy is the Circular Economy Action Plan, which was published in March of last year, leading on from the previous or the predecessor European Green Deal. And it's interesting that in this document, it has a chapter, of course, dealing with waste management, but it doesn't mention waste to energy in terms. What it does talk about is the fact that up to 80% of products' environmental impacts are determined at the design phase. There's a much greater emphasis in this policy document on designing out or designing for environmental aims to be achieved and designing out waste. And you'll see in the second quote there is also an emphasis on reducing residual municipal waste. So that is the waste that would go into waste to energy plants. But there isn't a mention of waste to energy in terms. And I think that is interesting because, as I say, there is debate around the role that waste to energy should play and the role that it plays in developing a circular economy in terms of setting incentives. And there could be, I think, potentially some divergence, or at least it's something to watch, between UK policy on this and European policy on this in terms of the emphasis placed on waste to energy in each. A final thought on that is that the EU is also in the process of producing what's called the EU taxonomy. And this is an attempt to categorize different activities in terms of whether they contribute to sustainable development. And it is also in the process of harmonizing the categorization of waste across the EU. Now, the effectiveness of waste to energy, and indeed the way it provides incentives to people producing and disposing of products, is very much determined by how the input waste is categorized and how it is tracked. And I would suggest as a final thought that it will be crucial to see to what extent the UK aligns itself with or is involved with the development of international categorization of that type. And of course, we saw earlier that there is an obligation to cooperate in that way in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But the question, of course, is what will that look like in practice? Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for your presentations. That was very clear. I've got a couple of questions. So I think for Richard and for Ruth, first of all. So, Richard, I think in relation to what you said about aviation, I mean, given that access is ensured really by this system, air connectivity is secured. What are really the further challenges then which you see stemming from the system? And I suppose my second question isn't directly related to your presentation, but it's, can you give us any insights from Stansted as to the sorts of climate change issues that we might be seeing coming up in the decision?
Yeah, no, happy. I'll deal with those in turn. So I think in your introductory remarks on the last occasion that we 39 from 39 addressed this agreement, you quoted from the observation that it's the first example in trade negotiation history of parties starting off with free trade and then ending up with something a bit less than that. And it's really for that reason that I thought that it's not at the same scale as the other two factors. The pandemic has been very, very damaging to the aviation sector, obviously. And the sixth carbon budget places a very significant burden on all sectors, now including aviation. And I think to a degree, certainly the first, the pandemic, and possibly the second, act to mask the difficulties that the agreement poses to the sector so far as the UK is concerned, compared with what had gone before. But they still are there. And to give an example, the extent to which some of the areas that I touched on are as yet not concluded, that gives rise to uncertainty. There's an ongoing administrative burden to ensure proper cooperation and keep the skies open between the UK and the European Union. And I think that causes trouble for the industry, not on the scale that we've seen as a result of the pandemic, but trouble nonetheless. Now, in terms of the Stansted inquiry, a very big issue at that inquiry was need and therefore forecasting of aviation demand, and trying to marry that up with net zero, Section 1 of the Climate Change Act, the commitment that the UK government has made to returning to 1990 levels in terms of emission by 2050, but then also all these pretty hard-hitting recommendations that the Climate Change Committee has made. And, well, we'll have to wait and see. We finished on Friday. We had 3 inspectors. It's a bit like sitting in the Court of Appeal. You think you might have won over one and you hope that he will persuade the others. But I'd be very surprised if the decision letter, which is the first major aviation infrastructure project to be considered after the CCC recommendations, didn't devote a fairly significant part of itself to assessing what the effect of those recommendations are. And there may even be, just to finish up on this, a response from the government by the time that the decision letter is issued, in which case, of course, that would be a very material consideration, rather than, as Stansted argued, not a weighty one in the case of the recommendations from the CCC, which may yet not be followed. So I hope that gives some answer to the 2 raised.
It does. That's very helpful. It sounds like there's something there for a future webinar at some point, or even better, a seminar, if we're back to seminars by the time it comes out. Ruth, I had a question for you. There's obviously been a lot in the press about the environmental problems of old container vessels and other ships finding their way onto Bangladesh beaches and being broken up in terrible health and safety and environmental conditions. And clearly, a ship owner that sends their vessels there is saving a huge amount of money and gaining a competitive advantage over one who gets them recycled in a properly environmentally responsible way. Is there anything in the TCA that's relevant particularly to this, or is it simply the normal rules on waste?
Well, I think what is relevant to that, Stephen, is the Bâle Convention does define end-of-life ship proceedings for demolition in terms of waste. So it is covered by some of those rules. I think it is interesting thinking how timely that is, Stephen, because I know in a different context last week, the Court of Appeal, in the case of Begum, considered a strikeout application which arose out of demolition of an oil tanker in Bangladesh. So it's already coming for the courts, and you can see clearly there the incentives for people to get around things like the EU ship regulations or the Hong Kong Convention. One thing I think is relevant probably moving forward, again, on the interconnectedness, is that I do know that Bangladesh are apparently trying to move forward to be one of the, what would be 16 then signatures to the Hong Kong Convention. So hopefully this is something that moves forward. But certainly it does come within the Bâle Convention, albeit there's lots of different ways, unfortunately, around it that people seem to be very creative in finding.
Okay. Thank you, Ruth. We've just got one other question that's come in, I think, or maybe it's on the chat. Let me just see if I can find it. I can't see it on the Q&A.
Yes, it's on the chat.
Okay, I haven't got that, Richard. Can you, don't read out the person's name, but if you could just,
yes. Tom, the question is, do we expect climate change considerations and impact on local recycling arrangements to make life more difficult for future energy from waste incinerators to gain planning approval?
I think certainly that there's going to be a development in how waste to energy is seen, for sure. And I think as I pointed out, the EU policy appears to be moving in one way, and that carries with it a whole range of other implications in terms of how waste is categorized, what is fed into the system. And I think as that policy thinking develops, it's bound to influence as well the policy thinking in this country. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if life does start to get a little bit harder, and if there are more evidential and policy considerations that can be brought into those sorts of decisions. On the flip side, I think there's no doubt that there is still a need for residual waste to be dealt with and processed in some way, and it can't all just be recycled. And to some extent, the circular economy plan produced by the Commission, for example, arguably papers that over somewhat.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that is probably all the questions, and I think that we've taken up quite a bit of your time, so I think we'll draw to a conclusion there. So I'll thank the various presenters. I'll remind you of the date of the 15th of April, when we've got another of these events. If there are particular topics that you feel you'd like us to cover, then please get in touch. We've got our own ideas as to what we could cover, of course, but we'd very happily hear what you'd like us to cover that we haven't covered already from the TCA. And just to say that copies of the slides will be available probably from tomorrow morning, I suspect, on our website. So if you'd like to retain a copy of the slides, then just go to the website, you'll get those. So I think just remains for me to say thank you for listening, for your attention, and for joining us. Hope you'll be with us at future events, and have a good day for the rest of the day. Thanks very much. Bye for now.